I have buried 4 men, 2 horses, and 1 dog I loved more than most people, and I can tell you that none of those graves taught me what a single cold night did. It was the night a stranger I'd been raised to fear walked out of a blizzard carrying a child, stopped at the edge of my lantern light, and asked permission to die somewhere warm. He didn't beg. He just stood there with the snow turning his shoulders white and waited for me to decide what kind of man I was going to be, because both of us already knew the ranch couldn't survive what was coming, and only one of us understood it. I made a choice that night. I want to tell you it was a good one. The truth is messier than that. The truth is that everything good and everything terrible that happened to the Bar W in the next 30 years came down to whether I opened a door or let it stay shut. This is the story of the door. The cow died at 3 in the morning and took my last clean opinion of God with it. I'd been up to my elbows in her since midnight, Das holding the lantern, me trying to turn a breech calf that had wedged itself sideways like a stubbornness made of bone, and when she finally gave up, she did it without drama. One long shudder, a sound out of her like a gate dragging, then nothing, and the calf inside her dead too, and the 2 of us kneeling in straw gone dark with everything she'd had left. Das didn't say anything. Das was 19 and still believed effort and outcome were related. I let him keep believing it a while longer. I wiped my forearms on a feed sack, took out the little leather ledger I keep in my coat and made a mark. I should explain the ledger. My father kept one for money. I keep one for the other thing, what's owed and what's been paid. Not in dollars. A man pulls you out of a flooded creek, that goes in the book. You leave a friend bleeding because you were afraid, that goes in too on the other side, and it does not come out. By that February I had a lot more on the owing side than the paid. The cow was the 11th head we'd lost since Christmas, and every one of them went in the book under the same heading, which was the Bar W is dying, and I am the man watching it happen. Old Holly's vein had built that ranch out of nothing but spite and good water, and now the water was the trouble. The spring that fed our lower tank had been failing since fall, slowing, then crusting, then that winter freezing so hard and so early that what cattle we had left were walking 2 miles to the river and coming back thinner than they went. Holly's was 81 and bedbound with a chest that rattled when he breathed, and his granddaughter Cass ran the place now, which meant Cass and me ran the place, which meant we were losing it together. There's a kind of partnership in failure. Nobody writes songs about it. I just put the ledger away when the dogs started up. Not their coyote noise, not their stranger on the road noise. Something lower, uncertain, the sound a dog makes when it doesn't know whether to be brave. I looked at Das. Das looked at the barn door, which was rattling in its frame because the wind had been climbing all night, and was now doing the thing prairie wind does when it means business, not gusting but pressing, steady as a hand, driving snow flat across the yard, so the lantern light died 10 feet out and the world ended there. Stay with her, I said, meaning the cow, which made no sense, but a man says things. I took the lantern and went out. The cold hit me like a moral judgment. I'd been sweating in the barn and the sweat froze on me between one step and the next, and the snow came at my face sideways, fine as flour, finding every gap in my collar. I called the dogs and they came halfway, Belle with her hackles up, not barking now, just watching the dark past the corral. That's where I saw him. He was standing maybe 30 feet off, just inside where the light gave out, so that I saw him in pieces, a shoulder, the side of a face, the dark shape of a heavy blanket coat gone white across the top. He wasn't moving toward me. That was the first thing my body understood before my mind caught up. A man who means you harm closes the distance. This man had stopped at the exact edge of my light and was holding still, letting me look, the way you'd approach a horse that spooks easy. He was Apache. I knew it the way you know weather. The cut of him, the way he stood, the long gun held down and away, barrel toward the ground. And against the front of him, bundled inside his coat with only a face showing, was a child. Now I want to be honest about what happened in me, because if I clean it up the rest of this is worthless. What happened in me was fear, and the fear had a shape, and the shape had been put there years before by men around campfires and a newspaper that ran the same word, renegade, over any brown face it could find, and by one bad afternoon in '78 that I'm not going to tell you about yet. All of that came up my spine in a single second. My free hand had already gone to the pistol on my hip. I didn't draw, but my hand knew the way. The man saw it. Of course he saw it. Reading the next move of a frightened man was probably the only reason he was still alive. He didn't flinch and he didn't lift the rifle. He shifted his arms instead, just slightly, so the child showed more, turning the most vulnerable thing he had toward the gun, which is the opposite of what fear does, and I have thought about that gesture every day for 30 years. Then he spoke. His English was slow and careful, each word set down like he was crossing ice on it. "The girl is sick," he said. "I am not," he paused. "I am asking, that is all." Asking. He'd come out of a killing storm with a sick child, and the first thing he did was hand me the power to refuse him. Here is where I have to tell you about the choice, because everything in 3 parts hangs off this minute, and I won't pretend it didn't. If I let them in, I was breaking the law as the town understood it, and a good deal of the law as the territory wrote it. There was an order out. There was always an order out about a pash off the reservation, and a man who sheltered one could lose his stock, his standing, and in a bad week his neck. The Bar W was already a carcass the bank and the neighbors were circling. Caleb Ruddock, who ran the Lazy Eight to our east and who wanted our water more than he wanted heaven, would have paid money for a reason to call the soldiers down on us. Taking these two in didn't just risk me. It risked Cass, and old Holly's in his bed, and Das, who was 19 and stupid with loyalty. If I turned them away, they would die. Not maybe. The storm was the kind that came once a winter and killed whatever it found in the open. The child would go first. I stood there with snow filling my collar, and the dog pressed against my leg, and the dead cow behind me in the barn. And I did the arithmetic that I'd like to say I'm proud of. I'm not, particularly. I didn't decide out of goodness. I decided because of the ledger. Because the truth was my book was lopsided and had been for years, heavy on the owing side, and I was tired, bone tired, soul tired of being a man who left people in the cold. The cow had just died for no reason I could fix. The ranch was dying for no reason I could fix. And here, at last, in the middle of all that helplessness, was one thing I could do something about. One door I could open. "Come in out of it," I said. My voice came out rougher than I meant. "Barn's warm, there's a stove." He didn't move right away. He looked at me a moment longer, measuring, I think, whether I'd shoot him in the back the second he stepped into the light. Then he came, walking the careful, flat-footed walk of a man saving everything he has, and as he passed into the lantern's reach I saw how far gone he actually was. Not him, he was iron. The girl. Her face was the gray-white of old snow, and her breath was coming in the little hitching gasps that I knew too well from too many sickbeds, croup or worse. She was maybe 6. Das about dropped the lantern when we came through the barn door. To his credit, he didn't say the word I could see climbing up his throat. He looked at me, and I looked back, and whatever he read in my face shut his mouth, and I marked that down later too, on the paid side, the first entry in Das's account. Held his tongue when it counted. "Stoke that stove," I told him, "and go to the house quiet and wake Cass. Nobody else. You understand me, nobody else." The man set the child down on the clean straw near the stove with a tenderness that didn't match anything I'd been taught to expect, peeling back the frozen outer blanket to get her closer to the heat. Up close he was younger than the storm had made him look, 30 maybe, with a long-healed scar pulling at one eyebrow and eyes that did not stop moving, cataloging the barn, the doors, the loft, the pitchfork me. A man who'd learned the hard way that the room is always a list of things that can kill you. "What's wrong with her?" I said, crouching a careful distance off. "Her chest." He pressed 2 fingers to the girl's sternum lightly, and she stirred and made the hitching sound. 3 days we could not stop, there were riders. He said it flat, no plea in it. "I am das soda. She is Nalia, my brother's daughter. A pause. Her father is dead, last week. I didn't ask how. The word riders had told me enough, and the territory was full of men who'd shoot first and call it law after. Cass came through the small door in a coat over her nightdress, hair loose, a lamp in one hand and, God help her, old Holly's Colt in the other, because Das in his 19-year-old wisdom had apparently told her we got a pash in the barn and nothing else. She stopped dead. The lamp shook. I watched her take it all in. The man, the gun he'd set deliberately against the wall out of his own reach, the child gasping by the stove. Cass Vane was 26 and had been making impossible choices since she was 19, and her grandfather's mind started going soft at the edges. She lowered the Colt without my asking. She'd done her own arithmetic faster than I'd done mine. That child needs steam and an onion poultice and somebody who knows what they're doing, she said, which is not any of us. She looked at Dasoda. Is it croup or is it the lung fever? He blinked. I think it surprised him to be asked. I think the second. It is in the deep part now, the rattle. He touched his own chest. My grandmother knew the plant for this. I do not have it. I've got mullein and I've got bear grease and I've got a kettle, Cass said. You tell me what your grandmother did. We'll do it together. And she knelt down in the straw beside the child of a man the whole territory called an enemy, and the two of them, the rancher's granddaughter and the Apache who'd come out of the dark, bent their heads over a sick little girl and went to work, and I stood there holding a lantern feeling something in my chest move that I didn't have a name for yet. We worked until the gray came up. I'll spare you the doctoring. It was steam and patience, and Cass's hands and Dasoda's grandmother's knowledge passed down through a man who'd thought he had no use for it anymore. Around dawn the child's breathing eased, not well, but easier, the hitching slowing into something more like sleep. Dasoda sat back on his heels and let out a breath that seemed to take 10 years off him, and for one unguarded second, his face was just a man's face, an uncle's face, terrified and grateful and hollowed out by a week of running. He caught me looking. The guard came back down, but not all the way. You did not have to, he said. No, I agreed. There didn't seem any point lying about it. I didn't. He nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something. Then he said the thing that started the rest of it, the thing that turned a single act of mercy into the hinge the whole ranch swung on. Your water, he said, the low spring, I saw it coming in, it is not dead. He looked at me steadily. It is buried, the ground moved the cold or before. The water went sideways under. My people know this ground. We drank from that spring before there was a fence. Not an accusation, just a fact laid down flat like all his words. I can find where it goes. I stared at him. Outside, the wind was finally dying, the way those storms do at dawn, exhausted by their own meanness. Inside, a sick child breathed in the straw, and a rancher's granddaughter slept sitting up with her head against a stall, and an old man rattled in a house full of debt, and I stood there with my crooked ledger in my coat and understood, dimly, that I had opened a door I was never going to be able to close. Why would you do that? I asked. Find our water, after I didn't finish, after everything was too big to say. Dasoda looked at the girl, then at me, and the thing he said I wrote in the book that morning, on the paid side, in the only handwriting I've got, which is bad. Because you asked me to come in out of it, he said, before you knew if I would cost you everything. Dasoda found the water on the 4th day, and that was the day Caleb Ruddick rode into the yard with 3 men, and a question he already knew the answer to. But I have to go back, because the 4 days mattered. He shouldn't have stayed. We both knew it. A sane man would have rested the child a night and gone the moment she could travel, gone deep into the country where the soldiers and the riders couldn't follow, gone anywhere but a fenced ranch 9 miles from a town that would hang him on principle. He stayed because of the spring, and because Nalia was still too weak, and I came to understand later because of something harder to name, something to do with the door and with Cass. I watched it happen across those days, and I didn't have the sense to be afraid of it, which tells you what kind of fool I am. He worked the low ground at first light and dusk, when the chance of being seen from the road was least, walking the frozen draws with his head down, reading the land the way I read my ledger, every dip and crust, and the particular slant of old grass that meant water had run there once. Cass went with him on the second day, then the third, ostensibly to learn the ground, and they'd come back up to the house in the blue cold with their breath hanging, and a kind of ease between them that I hadn't seen on Cass since before her grandfather started dying by inches. I want to be careful here. This is not the story where the rancher's daughter and the noble stranger fall into each other's arms, and the world is mended by love. The world isn't mended that easy, and that wasn't what I saw. What I saw was two people who'd each been carrying something alone, she the ranch, he the girl, and the grief of a murdered brother, discover that for an hour at a time, walking a frozen creek bed, they didn't have to carry it alone. That's a smaller thing than love and a rarer one. I marked it in the book and I worried over it, because I knew what it would cost if anyone saw. Holly saw. The old man's body was failing, but his mind, that February, kept surfacing like a swimmer gone for days, then suddenly, terribly clear. On the third night Cass had me help him out to the front room where he could sit by the fire, and Dasoda was there warming his hands, and Holly's looked at him a long while with those pale, wrecked eyes. "You're Chiricahua," he said finally, not a question. Dasoda went still. "Yes." "I killed Chiricahua," Holly said, in the flat, exhausted voice of a man past lying. "In '72, 3 of 'em that I'm sure of, maybe more." The fire popped. Nobody breathed. "Took this ground from your people, put a fence on water that fed you before me." He worked his mouth. "And now you're crawling through my drawers in the cold to give it back to me so my granddaughter don't lose it." A terrible sound came out of him that took me a second to recognize as a laugh. God's got a sense of humor I never cared for. I waited for Dasoda to leave. I would have. Any man with sense would have walked into the storm rather than sit by the fire of a man who just confessed to killing his people. Dasoda didn't move. He looked at the old man for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was very quiet. "My grandmother told me," he said, "that the ground does not belong to the man with the fence or the man who was here before the fence. It belongs to whoever the water keeps alive." He nodded at the dark window, the buried spring out there under the snow. "I am not finding your water, old man. I am finding the water. The girl in the barn will drink it. Your granddaughter will drink it. That is enough reason." A pause. "I do not forgive you. Forgiveness is not mine to give for the dead. But I will not let a child die of thirst to spite a dying man." Holly stared at him. Then he nodded slow and turned his ruined face back to the fire, and something passed out of the room that had been sitting on all of us. Not the guilt. The guilt stayed, but the pretending. After that the old man and the Apache sat by the fire most nights and didn't speak much and didn't need to. 2 men at the end of different roads that had crossed in one bloody place, neither one able to undo it, both too tired to keep lying about it. I put it in the book and I didn't know which side to put it on. Some things don't go on a side. Some things just go down so they're not forgotten. The water came up on the 4th morning. Dasoda had found where the spring went sideways underground, a collapse, old maybe from a quake before any of us were born. The flow shunted into a rocky draw a 1/4 mile east where it pooled and froze and hid. He and I and Das spent 2 days breaking ground in the killing cold, following his read of the land, and on the 4th morning Das's pick went through into mud, and then into water, dark and cold and moving, and the boy let out a whoop that probably carried to the next county. That whoop, I have always believed, is what brought Ruddock. Caleb Ruddock wanted the Bar W's water the way some men want a woman who won't have them, past reason, past profit, into something like hate. He'd offered to buy us out twice at robbery prices, banking on the failing spring. And now here he came up the road with 3 hired men, and he sat his horse in our yard and looked at the steam rising off the newly opened water, and then he looked at Dasoda standing at the edge of it with a pick in his hands, and his face did a thing I'll never forget. It lit up like Christmas. "Well now," he said, "Cassandra Vane, you've been harboring." He smiled around the yard at his men at the whole gray morning. "There's an order out. You know there's an order out, sheltering a hostile." He shook his head with enormous false sorrow. "That's your stock forfeit, that's your land in question, that's maybe a rope for the men." His eyes slid to Dasoda and stayed. "For one of you, surely." And here came the second choice, the one that split everything. Because Ruddick wanted Dasoda. That was the prize, not the water, the Apache. A brown body he could drag to town as proof and parlay into the ranch while we were tangled up answering for him. And I saw Dasoda understand it in the same instant I did. I saw him measure the distance to his rifle against the wall of the barn. I saw him glance once fast at the barn door behind which Nalia slept, getting stronger every day, a child who would be alone in the world the second they took him. He set down the pick. "Cass," I said low, not taking my eyes off Ruddick, "don't." Because I could see her about to do the brave, stupid thing. The "he saved this ranch, he's under my protection" thing. The thing that would put a rope around her own neck alongside his and change nothing for Dasoda, except that he'd watch her hang too. Dasoda spoke before either of us could ruin it. "I came in the night," he said to Ruddick, loud and clear, stepping away from us toward the riders, hands open and empty. "3 days ago, I forced the door, I took food. The woman did not know." Each word laid down flat like ice he was crossing, and I understood he was building us an alibi out of his own body, lying to save people who'd given him 4 days of warmth. "There is no harboring, there is a thief. Take the thief." "Dasoda," Cass's voice cracked. He didn't look at her. He couldn't, I think, or he wouldn't have been able to keep walking. He kept his eyes on Ruddick, kept his hands open, kept walking toward the men who'd come to destroy us, carrying the whole weight of the order out on his own back so it couldn't fall on ours. And that was the moment, God forgive me. That was the exact moment that I finally understood what I'd opened the door to 4 nights before. Not a stranger, not a risk, a man who would lay his life down across the gap in my crooked ledger to balance a debt he didn't even owe. I want to tell you I drew my gun. I want to tell you Das and I faced down 4 armed men and rode off the Lazy 8 and saved him clean. We didn't. There were 4 of them and they were ready, and Nalia was 30 feet away behind a thin barn wall, and a gunfight in that yard ends with a dead child as sure as the sunrise. Dasoda knew it. That's why he was walking. He'd done the arithmetic faster and colder than any of us, and the answer he'd reached was me, only me, and let the rest live. Ruddick's men took him, bound his hands, put him on a spare horse. And as they turned to ride out, Dasoda finally looked back, not at Cass, which would have given it away, but at me. He held my eyes across the cold yard, and he tipped his chin once toward the barn, toward the girl. "They didn't hang him." I need to say that first, because I've made you fear it for 2 parts, and the truth is stranger and, in its way, harder. They didn't hang him because of Nalia, and Nalia happened because of a choice Cass made that I argued against and was wrong too. Here is what happened in town, pieced together over years from a dozen people who were there. Ruddick rode Dasoda into the county seat expecting a hero's welcome and a quiet rope. What he got was a federal Indian agent named Pole who happened to be passing through on the very week, a fussy, unpopular, deeply honest man whose WHOLE Chinese letter job was the paperwork of who was supposed to be where, and who took one look at the situation and started asking the questions Ruddick didn't want asked. What hostile act? What witnesses? What reservation? What band? What name? Ruddick had a thief he'd caught and a story about harboring he couldn't prove without dragging in the veins, and the second he tried, Pole wanted the veins brought in to testify. And the veins, when they came, told a story Cass and I had spent the worst night of our lives getting straight. We didn't tell Dasoda's lie. We told a better one. Cass stood up in that crowded room with old Holly's vein beside her in a borrowed chair, the old man dragging himself off his deathbed for this one last thing, the hardest ride of his life made in a wagon, and they said, in front of the agent and the town and a furious Ruddick, that Dasoda was their hired man. That he'd been on the Bar W since fall, working the water under contract, and that they had the wages in the book to prove it. We did have it in the book. I'd spent that night forging 4 months of backdated entries in my own bad handwriting into the ranch ledger, the real one. The money one, and Cass had signed them, and Hollis had pressed his shaking thumb to them, and may whatever's up there judge that lie as gently as I think it deserves. It shouldn't have held. It held because of Nalia. Because here's the thing Ruddock never understood and never could. You cannot make a town believe a man is a faceless hostile when his 6-year-old niece is sitting in the front row in a clean dress that the rancher's granddaughter sewed for her, coughing the last of the lung fever out of her small chest, watching the proceedings with her uncle's still dark eyes. The room came to see a renegade. They saw an uncle and a little girl. Some debts you can't make a crowd believe in, and some you can't make them forget. Pole, fussy, honest Pole, looked at that child and looked at his paperwork, and found that the simplest thing, the correct thing, was that a man with steady employment and a dependent and no proven crime was a man you released into the custody of his employer. Ruddock rode home with nothing. He sold the Lazy 8 inside 2 years and left the territory, and I won't pretend I was sorry, though I notice I never put him in the book at all. Some men aren't worth the ink. DeSoto came back to the Bar W, a free man and a legal one, and the strangest part of this whole strange story is that he stayed. Not for the reason the cheap version of this story would give you. Not because he fell in love with Cass and they married, and the ranch became one big happy family with the past all healed. Life isn't that obedient. He stayed the first year because Nalia needed somewhere to be a child and get strong, and the Bar W's new water meant the Bar W was the only place for miles that wasn't dying. He stayed the second year because Hollis finally died that autumn, quiet in his sleep, the rattle just stopping one night the way the cow's breathing had, and DeSoto was one of 4 men who carried him, which I will go to my own grave not fully understanding and not wanting to. He stayed the years after that because a thing had grown between him and Cass that I watched turn slowly, over a long time, with a great deal of silence and difficulty, and 2 cultures worth of grief between them, into a marriage. A quiet one, a hard one. Nalia stood up with them, 11 by then and tall. I'm an old man now and I run a small piece of the Bar W they deeded me, and the rest is theirs, and their children's Nalia's and the 2 more that came after, brown and stubborn and at home on water that an Apache man's grandmother taught him to find under frozen ground. The town that came to lynch, a renegade buys beef from his family now, and most of them have made themselves forget they ever felt otherwise. People are like that. The forgetting isn't forgiveness. But it lets the living go on, and I've stopped being too proud to take what lets the living go on. I still keep the ledger. I took it out last night, which is why I'm telling you all this. I'm near the end of it, the last few pages. And I went back to that February, to the entry I made the morning after the storm, and I read what DeSoto said to me, that I wrote down because it was too true to lose, because you asked me to come in out of it before you knew if I would cost you everything. For 30 years I read that as the thing that started it all, the mercy that paid off, the good deed rewarded, and last night, old and slow and finally honest, I saw I'd had it backwards the whole time. I didn't open that door out of goodness. I opened it because I was a coward who was tired of being a coward, because the ranch was dying and the cow was dead, and here at last was one thing I could fix. I opened it for me, and a better man than I'll ever be walked through it, and gave me a life I didn't earn and a family that isn't mine and a balanced book at the end of a crooked one. The arithmetic never came out the way I thought. I opened a door to do one small decent thing in a life short on them, and it changed the future of an entire ranch, an entire bloodline, an entire stretch of country with water running under it again. But that's not the part that keeps me up. The part that keeps me up is the simplest sum in the whole book, and I've checked it 1,000 times, and it always comes out the same, and I can't make eye.